the Indian economy contracted nearly a quarter of April and June, shrinking more than expected. After recording the first GDP contraction in more than 40 years, India's Q1 performance of 2021 is now eliciting different responses from different quarters. Ever since the numbers were out, a war of word has been raging on social media, particularly Twitter, which is abuzz with the hashtag GDP truth. One camp says that India did better than the peers, including the United States, in June quarter, while the other camp rubbishes all such claims. Now, before moving forward, let me give you an idea about the GDP. GDP, the gross domestic product, is basically calculated by adding consumption, investment, government expenditure and net exports. And now due to COVID-19 outbreak, the consumption and investment has hit the bottom. When the government expenditure has remained high as the government is trying to feed each and everyone and keep the economic engines on. The net exports are positive as well, but that's not a good sign either, as India's exports haven't risen but our imports have fallen sharply. So the only thing that is positive in last quarterly GDP was government expenditure, and that too has a limitation, as government has been selling PSUs, the public sector undertakings, and borrowing money to manage the rising fiscal deficit. Having learned the basics of the economics, let's be specific to the recent controversy, when particularly misleading number play was on the forefront. The BJP Twitter handles posted some misleading figures that claim that US GDP contracted 32%, while Indian GDP contracted 23% in the June quarter. Many on Twitter seem to have bought into the narrative that India performed better than the United States, contracting much less in the June quarter. While this could not have been farther from the truth, some established media names also fell for the misleading statistics. There are still articles online that are misrepresenting global GDP statistics. Some of them even feature photoshopped pictures that were doing the rounds on Twitter and WhatsApp. The misleading comparison even got featured by some big shot news channels, the videos of which are still up and uncorrected. All this comparison seems to be wrong altogether, because the US GDP contraction of 32% versus India's 23% in the June quarter is absolutely wrong. Here's the deal. Different countries use different approaches when calculating GDP. India does GDP calculations on the basis of year on year, while several other countries like America and Europe does quarter on quarter. Hence, while we compare Q1 of fiscal year 2020 with the Q1 of fiscal year 2019, other countries like America may compare Q2 with the Q1 of the same year. And that's where the difference lies. The difference lies in how India and the US report GDP growth. In India, GDP growth for a quarter is calculated by comparing to the same quarter of the previous year. A year-on-year comparison which puts India's GDP contraction at 23% for this June quarter. On the other hand, the US does a quarter-on-quarter comparison and then analyzes the figure. It means that GDP for the quarter is compared to the previous quarter. So they assumed that this quarter's fall would continue at the same rate for the next 3 quarters, which resulted in the estimated contraction of 32% for the US economy on annualized basis. These are two completely different measures. They cannot be compared. US compares what happened in this quarter to the previous quarter, and India compares what happened this quarter to the same quarter in the previous year. If we calculate America's GDP the Indian way, then the US would register a decline of just 9% and India a decline of 23%. Such false comparisons are primarily being made to shield the government from criticism for its handling of the economy. And such ostrich behavior is not going to help us. But one must not forget that COVID-19 has been one of the worst enemies for the economic engines of India and the other parts of the world. Several international rating agencies estimate that Indian growth numbers would turn negative in the coming quarters ahead. Apart from the worrisome GDP figures, many other concerns are afflicting the Indian economy, even as the lockdown is being gradually lifted. The GDP growth seems to be an appalling low. Production have been almost nil because of the lockdown restrictions. Even if it is restored, immediate demand would be scarce. Given the restrictions and prevailing apprehensions, private investment and exports have also declined. Based on these crucial factors, many economic pundits have predicted India's GDP would come in at appalling low level. The central bank has also averred that GDP growth would remain in the negative territory in the coming fiscal year 21. One of the biggest threat to the economy that is not showing signs of recovery is unemployment. 27 million people in the age group of 20 to 30 years have lost their jobs in April. 2.5 crore लोगों ने अपनी नौकरी खो दी, taking the country's unemployment rate to 24%. Further exacerbating the situation is the fact that migrant populations living in the big Indian cities have been moving back home to their native villages, and the renowned startups like Ola, Uber and Swiggy have been laying off workforce. The gig economy is crumbling. Another hit would be coming from the fiscal position of the state. The government has recently announced several stimulus packages to revive demand and focus on supply. Though it was less of a stimulus package and more of a loan mela. The RBI also announced several relief measures and brought the repo rate down to just 4%, which would impact the balance sheet in months to come. The government expenditure could get lower as its revenue gets impacted due to low GST collection and low income tax and corporation tax collections on account of the lockdown. And government needs to deliver the rupees 20 trillion stimulus package promised earlier. This might come at a huge fiscal deficit, and government is selling PSUs to monetize the deficits, and this measure can't be used beyond certain point. कब तक बेचोगे सरकारी कंपनियों को? कितनी है? Government borrowings are increasing as well, and this would push the fiscal deficit up and through. FDI flows has been the only major bright spot in Indian economy. FPI, the foreign portfolio investors, and FDI inflows have been intact as India continues to enjoy the trust of foreign investors. Facebook आया India, Qualcomm India आ गया, Google is investing so much in India, $10 billion approx. So this seems to be the silver lining in the dark clouds. FDI is crucial to growth in this financial year, since it could create a lot of employment opportunities. With many companies leaving China due to their alleged role in spreading the virus and setting up manufacturing units in other Asian countries, this could be India's movement in attracting investment. But we have been largely defeated in this game by Vietnam. No matter how hard we try, Vietnam is way ahead of us in fetching those investments from China, as most of the companies that flew out of China established their factories in Vietnam, not in India. Just an iota of companies have come down to India. Majority, 95% of the corporations have either gone to Vietnam or Taiwan. Trade deficit being at worst in 4 years is one of the major economic threats. While India has always been a current account deficit country, we import more than we export, right? The recent data shows that exports have shrunk by massive 61% in April. Though the trade deficit is at the lowest in the past 4 years, and that's not a good sign either, because the trade deficit lessened, it got reduced because our imports have fallen sharply than our exports. ऐसा नहीं है कि हमारे एक्सपोर्ट्स बहुत बढ़ गए इसलिए ट्रेड डेफिसिट कम हो गया, बट हमारे इंपोर्ट्स कम हो गए हैं और एक्सपोर्ट्स भी कम हो गए. 70% of export orders have been cancelled because of the global shutdown. Going ahead, one needs to look out for the oil prices, as these form the biggest chunk of India's trade basket. As per the data by the National Statistical Office, all key sectors except agriculture, सिर्फ खेती को छोड़ के, खेती बाड़ी को छोड़ के, all these other sectors witnessed contraction, with construction, trade, hotels, transport, tourism, communication and services related to broadcasting witnessed a drop of whopping 50%, while the manufacturing industry saw a drop of 40%. Only the agricultural, forestry and fishing industry witnessed a growth of 3.4% in the June quarter. Even the robust performance in the agriculture sector during quarter 1 of 2021 has not helped much. After all, this sector contributes just 15% of the GDP. But here one needs to keep in one major point in mind. The GDP for June-March quarter, the quarter 4 of the last quarter of 2020 had witnessed a growth of 3.1%. In January to March quarter, which is the quarter 4 of 2019, India was the top performer among G20 economies. The countries that introduced stringent lockdown measures earliest saw the largest contraction in GDP in the first quarter of 2020. जिन कंट्रीज़ ने जितना जल्दी लॉकडाउन अनाउंस किया था या जितना लंबी देर तक लॉकडाउन रखा, उस कंट्री को उतना ज़्यादा नुकसान हुआ. और यहाँ पर हमारी गवर्नमेंट ने सबसे लंबी ड्यूरेशन तक लॉकडाउन रखा है हिंदुस्तान में, ऑलमोस्ट 2 महीने तक. तो ऑफकोर्स सी बात है हमारी इकॉनमी ज़्यादा कॉन्ट्रैक्ट होगी, ज़्यादा सिकुड़ेगी. द चाइनीज़ इकॉनमी कॉन्ट्रैक्टेड बाय -9.8% and France and Italy by -5.3%. GDP also fall sharply in Germany and Canada by 2.1%, and the United Kingdom observed the GDP growth of -2%. GDP also contracted in Brazil and United States, Korea and Mexico. They observed -1.3% GDP growth. In negative territory, the contraction was less pronounced in Japan and Indonesia, where the GDP growth rate was just -0.7%. Australia, it was around negative 0.3%. Australia में negative 0.3% growth rate थी. But India and Turkey were the only two G20 economies recording positive growth in the first Jan to March quarter of 2020. सिर्फ इंडिया और टर्की जनवरी से मार्च क्वार्टर में सिर्फ इंडिया और टर्की ही 2 G20 नेशंस थे जिनकी ग्रोथ रेट 3% पॉजिटिव 3% रही. With higher performance in quarter 1, naturally the negative growth in April and June quarter would get magnified on quarter basis. While the situation seems to look severe, which no one could have predicted, there is still hope. With companies and production gradually resuming, with the phased lifting of the lockdown and the possibility of a vaccine on the horizon, the economy could make a huge comeback, which could lead to more positive developments than those being currently predicted. क्योंकि हर पेंडेमिक के बाद ये इकोनॉमिक एविडेंस है कि हर पेंडेमिक के बाद इकोनॉमी बाउंस बैक करती है. ऐसा 1918 के बाद जब स्पेनिश फ्लू आउटब्रेक हुआ था दुनिया में, तो 1918 की जो इकोनॉमी थी इट it got down to just negative 18%. लेकिन the very next year 1919 में जो इकोनॉमी थी it bounced back and the world observed a 3% of positive growth. So the dear government, instead of indulging in creative accounting and statistical jugglery, we need to face up to the facts. As a consequence of GDP contraction in India are more dire than in most other countries. As before the outbreak of pandemic, we were not doing economically well either. We were already dealing with shrinking economic growth. So for God's sake, wake up until it's too late.